They inherited a forgotten cabin buried under 30 feet of snow, expecting nothing but rotting wood and broken memories. But when they finally cleared the entrance to the hidden root cellar, what they found wasn't just gold. It was $265 million worth of it, and a secret so dangerous that people had already died trying to protect it. Before we dive into this incredible true story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October, the kind of grey autumn day when the world feels like it's holding its breath before winter. Margaret Foster stood at her kitchen counter, hands trembling slightly as she held the certified letter. She was 73 years old, her silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, her weathered hands marked by decades of honest work. Beside her, Harold, her husband of 51 years, leaned on his cane and peered over her shoulder with the same curiosity that had kept them together through good times and lean ones. The return address meant nothing to her. Whitmore and Associates, attorneys at law, Billings, Montana. They lived in a modest two-bedroom house on the outskirts of Helena, Montana, a place where winters bit hard and summers offered brief relief. Harold had retired from the railroad 8 years ago with a pension that barely covered their expenses. Margaret had worked as a seamstress until arthritis made holding a needle too painful. They weren't poor, but they counted every dollar, clipped every coupon, and prayed the furnace would last one more winter. "You going to open it or just stare at it all morning?" Harold asked, his voice carrying the gentle teasing that had survived 5 decades of marriage. Margaret slid her finger under the seal and pulled out several pages of legal documents. Her eyes scanned the words once, twice, 3 times, not quite believing what she was reading. "Harold," she whispered, "it says we inherited property." He adjusted his glasses, the thick kind that made his blue eyes look larger than they were. "From who?" "Someone named Ernest Calloway." She looked up at him, confusion clouding her features. "Do we know an Ernest Calloway?" Harold's brow furrowed. He had a good memory for names, better than most men his age. Calloway, Calloway. Then his eyes widened. "Wait, your mother's side? Wasn't there a Calloway branch?" Margaret's mother had passed 20 years ago, taking most of the family history with her. There had been mention of distant cousins, people who'd moved west during the Depression, scattered across Montana and Wyoming like seeds in the wind. But Ernest Calloway? She couldn't place him. "Says here he passed away 6 months ago," Margaret continued reading. "No living heirs except distant relatives. We're listed as next of kin through your maternal grandmother's line." "What kind of property?" Harold asked. Margaret flipped to the second page. "A cabin, 16 acres, located in the Bitterroot Mountains, near the Idaho border." They both fell silent. The Bitterroot Mountains were remote, rugged, the kind of place where people went to disappear, or to find themselves, depending on their intentions. Margaret had never been that far west in Montana, though Harold had passed through once on a hunting trip 40 years ago. "Does it say anything about the condition?" Harold asked. Margaret scanned the document. "Just says the property is unoccupied, and has been for approximately 23 years. We have 60 days to claim it, or it reverts to the state." Harold lowered himself carefully into a kitchen chair, the wood creaking under his weight. He'd been a strong man once, broad-shouldered and capable. Now his body carried the weight of time, a bad hip from a railroad accident, knees that complained with every step, hands that shook when he tried to hold a coffee cup too long. 23 years unoccupied, he repeated. That's a long time for a place to sit empty in mountain country. Probably falling apart. Probably, Margaret agreed. But something in her voice held a thread of hope. They spent the rest of the morning discussing it over weak coffee and toast. The practical side of Margaret said to let it go. Sign the papers, declining the inheritance, avoid the hassle. But there was another side. A quieter voice that remembered the girl she'd been at 20, full of dreams about adventures she'd never taken, places she'd never seen. We should at least look at it, she said finally. Harold studied his wife's face, seeing past the wrinkles and age spots to the woman who'd once climbed mountains with him when their knees were young and their hearts were brave. All right, he said. 3 days later, they loaded Harold's old Ford pickup with supplies, flashlights, tools, warm clothes, and enough food for a few days. The drive would take them nearly 4 hours into increasingly remote territory. Margaret had called the law office to get exact directions. The attorney had been surprised to hear from them. Most people don't bother. The lawyer, a woman named Patricia, had said over the phone, the property's quite isolated. No utilities, no road access for the last 3 miles. You'd have to hike in. And this time of year, well, you might want to wait until spring. But Margaret and Harold weren't the waiting type. Not anymore. When you're in your 70s, every season feels precious. Every delay feels permanent. The highway carved through pine forests and past mountain ranges that seemed to touch the clouds. Harold drove slowly, his grip tight on the wheel, while Margaret navigated with a worn map and the coordinates the lawyer had provided. They passed through small towns that barely qualified as dots on the map. 3 buildings and a post office. Maybe a gas station if you were lucky. We're getting close, Margaret said as they turned onto a Forest Service road. The pavement gave way to gravel, then to dirt, packed hard by years of disuse. After another hour, Harold pulled the truck to the side of what could barely be called a road. This is as far as we can drive, he said. They stepped out into cold mountain air that bit at exposed skin. Margaret pulled her knit cap lower over her ears and zipped her coat to her chin. The elevation was higher here, probably 7,000 feet, maybe more. The sky was gray, pregnant with the promise of snow. According to the map, Margaret said, the cabin should be about 2.5 miles northwest of here. Harold looked at the dense forest ahead, the rocky terrain, and his own aging body. That's a good hike. We've done harder, Margaret said, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true anymore. They shouldered their backpacks. Harold insisted on carrying the heavier one despite Margaret's protests, and started walking. The forest was thick with lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, their branches heavy with the weight of approaching winter. The ground was carpeted with pine needles and the first dusting of early snow. Everything smelled clean and sharp, like the earth itself was breathing. They walked for over an hour, stopping frequently to rest Harold's hip and catch their breath in the thin air. Margaret's knees ached, but she pushed forward, driven by something she couldn't quite name. Curiosity, maybe, or stubbornness, or perhaps just the need to see this through. To claim something that was rightfully theirs, in a world that had taken so much. There, Harold said suddenly, pointing through the trees. Margaret squinted and saw it. A structure, barely visible beneath what looked like an impossible amount of snow. The cabin had been built into the side of a hill, Its roof collapsed under the weight of decades of accumulated snowpack. What had once been a modest log structure was now more snow than wood. A white mound that looked like a natural formation rather than something built by human hands. They approached slowly, their boots crunching through the crusted snow. Up close, the devastation was even more apparent. The front wall had partially caved in. Windows were shattered. The door hung at an odd angle. One hinge broken, the other rusted into permanence. "Well," Harold said, his voice carrying a weight of disappointment. "At least we know why Ernest Calloway didn't leave it to anyone important." Margaret walked around the structure, her practiced eye taking in the damage, but something caught her attention. Despite the obvious neglect, despite the collapsed roof and broken windows, the log walls themselves were solid. The timber had been cut and notched with skill, the kind of craftsmanship you didn't see anymore. And the foundation, what she could see of it, was stone, fitted together without mortar. The old way, the way that lasted. "This was built by someone who knew what they were doing," she said. Harold joined her, leaning heavily on his cane. Shame it wasn't maintained. They spent the next hour carefully exploring what they could access of the cabin. Inside, snow had drifted through the broken windows and collapsed sections of roof, creating bizarre sculptures of white and shadow. What furniture remained was destroyed. A table collapsed under moisture and weight. Chairs reduced to kindling. A metal bed frame rusted into an orange skeleton. But there were traces of life, too. Shelves still lined one wall, their contents long since removed or rotted away. A stone fireplace dominated the far end, its chimney still intact, suggesting the structure could potentially be repaired if someone had the time, money, and motivation. "Look at this," Harold called from near the fireplace. Margaret picked her way carefully through the debris. Harold was pointing at something carved into the mantel, letters worn smooth by time but still legible. E.C. 1947. "Ernest Calloway," Margaret whispered. "He built this place 76 years ago." Harold added, "Long time for a building to stand." Margaret ran her fingers over the carved letters, feeling the grooves, worn smooth by decades of weather and neglect. There was something intimate about it, like touching a piece of history that had been waiting all this time to be found. Whoever Ernest Calloway had been, he'd stood in this very spot 76 years ago and marked his work, claimed it, made it his. She turned slowly, taking in the ruined interior. Snow had drifted into corners, creating strange patterns of white against dark wood. A bird's nest sat abandoned in what remained of a window frame. The floorboards, where visible beneath the snow and debris, were wide planks of solid timber, warped now but still intact. "It's too bad," Harold said quietly. "In its day, this must have been something." Margaret nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something. She'd spent 50 years as a seamstress, learning to spot the hidden seams, the places where fabric folded in on itself to create pockets and compartments. Buildings were just fabric made of wood and stone, and this building had secrets. She moved to the corner where the shelves stood, brushing away snow to examine them more closely. They were built into the wall itself, not added later, but integrated into the structure. That was unusual for a cabin of this era. Most shelves were freestanding or crudely nailed up as an afterthought. "Harold," she called. "Come, look at this." He made his way over, his cane finding purchase carefully on the uneven floor. "What is it?" Margaret pointed to the shelves. "See how they're built. They're part of the wall structure, not added later. And look here." She traced a line with her finger. "This support beam goes down through the floor. That's not normal for shelving." "Maybe it's a root cellar entrance," Harold suggested. "Old cabins often had them." But Margaret shook her head. "Root cellar entrances are usually outside, or if they're inside, they're near the kitchen area for easy access. This is in the corner, hidden behind shelves." They spent several minutes clearing debris from around the shelving unit, working carefully despite their aching joints. Margaret's fingers were numb with cold, but she kept at it, driven by instinct more than logic. Then her hand brushed against something that shouldn't be there. A gap, a seam in the floorboards that didn't match the others. She cleared more debris, revealing a rectangular outline in the floor, roughly 3 feet by 3 feet. "Harold," she said, her voice tight with excitement, "there's a door here." He knelt beside her, grimacing as his knees protested. Together they cleared the last of the debris, revealing the full outline. Set into the center was a metal ring, recessed into the wood, green with oxidation, but still solid. Margaret's heart was pounding now, though she couldn't have said why. Every practical instinct told her this was probably just a root cellar, a place to store vegetables and preserved food during the long Montana winters. But something about the way it had been concealed, the care taken to hide it behind built-in shelving, suggested this was more than that. "Should we open it?" she asked. Harold looked at the ring, then at Margaret, then back at the ring. "We came all this way," he said. "Might as well see what's down there." Margaret gripped the metal ring with both hands. It was cold enough to burn, even through her gloves. She pulled. Nothing happened. Harold added his strength to hers, both of them straining against rust and time. And whatever forces had sealed this door shut, for who knew how many years. On the third pull, something gave. A crack echoed through the ruined cabin, and the hatch lifted an inch. They repositioned their grip and pulled again. Another inch, then another. Finally, with a groan of protesting metal and wood, the hatch swung open, revealing darkness below. A rush of air escaped from the opening, carrying with it the smell of earth and stone, and something else, something cold and mineral that Margaret couldn't quite identify. It wasn't unpleasant, just strange, like the air from a place that hadn't breathed in decades. Harold pulled out his flashlight and shone it down into the opening. The beam illuminated rough-cut stone steps, descending into darkness. They were steep, narrow, and looked treacherous. "That's not a root cellar," Margaret said quietly. "No," Harold agreed. "It's not." They both stood at the edge of the opening, staring down into darkness that seemed to have weight, substance, as if it could reach up and pull them down. The practical thing would be to close the hatch. Make note of it. Maybe come back with proper equipment and better light. They were 73 and 75 years old, respectively, with bad joints and worse balance. Descending unknown stairs into an underground chamber was exactly the kind of thing their children would scold them for. But their children weren't here. And the darkness below called to something in both of them. Some part that had been dormant for too long, the part that remembered when they were young and brave, and believed the world still held secrets worth discovering. "I'm going down," Margaret said. "Then we're both going down," Harold replied. They prepared carefully. Harold tested each step before putting his full weight on it. Margaret kept one hand on the stone wall, feeling the cold seep through her glove. The flashlight beam danced ahead of them, creating shadows that moved like living things. 15 steps down, Margaret counted. Then 20. Then 25. The air grew colder with each step. But it was dry cold. Preserved cold. The kind that suggested this space had been sealed for a very long time. At 33 steps, they reached bottom. The flashlight revealed a chamber carved from solid rock, roughly 15 feet square. The ceiling was supported by timber beams that looked ancient but solid, and the walls showed marks of careful excavation, smooth and even. This was dug by hand, Harold said, running his light along the walls. Someone spent months, maybe years, creating this space. But why? Margaret asked. Then her flashlight beam caught something along the far wall. Shelves, like the ones above, but these were intact, protected from weather and time. And on those shelves were boxes, wooden crates reinforced with metal corners, stacked neatly in rows. Harold, Margaret whispered. They moved forward together, their flashlights converging on the shelves. There had to be 30 crates, maybe 40, each about the size of a shoebox. They looked old but well maintained. The wood oiled, the metal free of rust. Margaret reached for the nearest crate with trembling hands. A metal clasp held it shut, stiff but functional. She worked it open, the small click echoing in the underground chamber. The lid lifted. Inside, resting on what looked like old velvet cloth, were 4 bars of metal. Even in the poor light, even tarnished with age, there was no mistaking what they were. Gold bars, each about the size of a deck of cards, each stamped with markings Margaret couldn't quite read. Harold, she breathed. He reached past her and lifted one of the bars. It was heavy, far heavier than its size suggested. He turned it toward his flashlight, and the stamp became clear. 20 ounces, fine gold. 1,946. For a long moment, neither of them moved. They barely breathed. The weight of the gold bar in Harold's hand seemed to anchor them to reality, proving this wasn't a dream or a mistake, or a trick of old eyes and dim light. Then, moving as if in a trance, Harold set the bar back in its crate and reached for another box. He opened it. More gold bars, different sizes but the same unmistakable substance. Another crate. Gold coins, hundreds of them, glinting in the flashlight beam. Margaret opened crate after crate, each one revealing more impossible wealth. American gold eagles, Canadian maple leafs, Krugerrands, bars stamped with dates ranging from the 1940s through the early 1990s. Even jewelry, heavy pieces that could only be solid gold. Her legs went weak, and she sat down hard on the dirt floor, her breath coming in short gasps. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. They were just 2 old people trying to get by, trying to make their pension stretch, trying to figure out if they could afford new hearing aids or whether the old ones would last another year. And now they were sitting in an underground chamber full of gold. Harold leaned against the stone wall, his face pale in the flashlight beam. "Margaret," he said, his voice shaking, "how much do you think is here?" She looked at the shelves, at the rows of crates they hadn't even opened yet. "I don't know," she whispered. "Millions? Tens of millions?" They spent the next hour opening every crate, their hands shaking, their hearts pounding, fear and excitement warring in their chests. They found a small notebook in one of the crates, its pages filled with careful handwriting, listing each piece, its weight, its approximate value. The last entry made Margaret's blood run cold. Total estimated value, as of 1997, $218 million. Adjusted for current gold prices, value approximately $265 million. She showed the notebook to Harold. He read it twice, then looked at her with eyes that held shock, fear, and something else. Something that looked like terror. "Someone hid this," he said slowly. "Someone went to enormous trouble to dig this chamber, hide this gold, and keep it secret, and they left it to us." "Why?" Margaret asked. "Why us? We never even knew Ernest Calloway existed." Harold shook his head. "I don't know. But Margaret, whoever hid this, they must have had a reason. And that reason probably isn't going to make us feel good about any of this." They carefully closed all the crates, arranging them exactly as they'd found them. Margaret took several photos with her old phone, though the quality was poor in the dim light. Then they stood at the bottom of the stone steps, both breathing hard, both trying to process what they'd discovered. "We need to get out of here," Margaret said. "We need to think. We need to figure out what this means." Harold nodded. "And we need to do it without anyone knowing what we found. Because, Margaret, gold like this, hidden like this, people have killed for a lot less." They climbed back up the 33 steps, Harold going first, Margaret following close behind. When they emerged into the ruined cabin, the grey daylight seemed impossibly bright after the darkness below. Together, they lowered the hatch carefully, making sure it settled exactly right. Then they piled debris back over it, covering it as completely as when they'd first arrived. To anyone else, it would look like just another section of collapsed floor. The hike back to the truck took longer than the hike in. Neither spoke. There were too many thoughts, too many questions, too much fear mixed with impossible hope. By the time they reached the ford, the sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the snow. Harold started the engine and turned the heat on high. They sat there warming their hands, neither making a move to drive. The enormity of what they'd found settled over them like the darkness settling over the mountains. "We can't tell anyone," Margaret said finally. "Not yet. Not until we understand what this is." Harold nodded slowly. "Someone hid that gold for a reason. Someone powerful. Someone dangerous. And they're probably still looking for it. Or their family is," Margaret added. They drove home in silence, through the gathering darkness. Two elderly people who'd left that morning expecting nothing, and were returning with a secret that could save them or destroy them, depending on what they did next. When they pulled into their driveway in Helena well after midnight, exhausted and overwhelmed, neither of them noticed the dark sedan parked 3 houses down, engine off, windows tinted. Someone inside watching and waiting, because Margaret and Harold weren't the first people to learn about the cabin and its secrets. They weren't even the first people to visit it in the last month. And the people who'd been watching that property for 76 years, waiting for someone to claim it and lead them to what Ernest Calloway had hidden. Those people had been very, very patient, but their patience was running out. The morning after their first visit to the cabin, Margaret woke before dawn with her mind racing. She'd barely slept, her thoughts churning through everything they'd seen. The collapsed structure, the careful craftsmanship beneath the ruin, those carved initials on the mantel. Something about it all felt incomplete, like a puzzle with missing pieces. Beside her, Harold stirred and opened his eyes. "You couldn't sleep either," he said. "It wasn't a question." "I keep thinking about that cabin," Margaret admitted. about why someone would build something so solid in such a remote location, then abandon it completely. Harold sat up slowly, wincing as his hip protested. "We should go back," he said. "Take another look. We were tired yesterday, probably missed things." Margaret nodded. She'd been thinking the same thing. They'd driven 4 hours to see the property, hiked 2.5 miles through rough terrain, and spent maybe an hour actually examining the cabin before exhaustion and disappointment had driven them back. But now, with distance and rest, she felt something pulling her back to that snow-buried structure. 2 hours later, they were on the road again. This time, Margaret had packed more supplies, better flashlights, a crowbar, work gloves, and a thermos of hot coffee. Harold had protested that they were too old to be playing treasure hunters, but his eyes held the same spark of curiosity that Margaret felt. The drive felt shorter this time, more familiar. They knew what to expect, where to turn, when the pavement would give way to gravel. When they reached the end of the drivable road and started the hike through the forest, Margaret felt her heart rate increase. Not from exertion, though her knees ached with each step, but from anticipation. The cabin looked different in the morning light. The sun, breaking through the pine trees, caught the snow covering the collapsed roof and made it sparkle like diamonds. For a moment, Margaret could almost see what it must have looked like when it was new. A solid log structure nestled into the mountainside, smoke curling from the chimney. Someone inside, living a life of deliberate isolation. "Let's be systematic this time," Harold suggested. "Start at one end, work our way through carefully, document everything." They began at the fireplace, since it was the most intact part of the structure. Margaret pulled out her phone and started taking photos while Harold examined the stonework. The fireplace was massive, built from river rock, fitted together with such precision that mortar had barely been necessary. Each stone had been chosen for its shape, its fit, its contribution to the whole. "This is masterwork," Harold said, running his hand along the smooth stones. "Whoever built this knew what they were doing." Margaret photographed the carved initials again. E.C. 1947. Then she noticed something she'd missed the day before. Carved much smaller, almost invisible unless you knew to look for it, were more markings below the date. She leaned closer, using her flashlight to illuminate the worn grooves. "Harold, look at this." He moved beside her, adjusting his glasses. It looked like coordinates or measurements. Numbers separated by dashes. 45, 32, 18. Then below that, 114, 6, 42. "Those look like coordinates," Margaret said. "Latitude and longitude." Harold pulled out his phone and opened a maps application. He entered the numbers carefully. The screen loaded, and a pin dropped on their exact location. "He's marking this spot," Harold said slowly. "But why? If you're already here, why would you need coordinates carved into your own fireplace?" "Unless," Margaret said, thinking out loud, "you wanted someone else to find it. Someone who might not know exactly where to look." They continued their exploration, and Margaret began noticing other markings. On one of the support beams that hadn't collapsed, someone had carved a series of notches. Not random marks, but deliberate cuts in groups of 5, like someone counting something. She counted them. 34 groups of 5, then 3 additional marks. 173 total. What were they counting? She wondered aloud. Harold was examining the floor near the corner where the shelves stood. "Margaret, come look at this." She picked her way across the debris-strewn floor. Harold was pointing at the floorboards. They were wider than modern lumber, probably 12 inches across, hand-hewn from massive trees. But what Harold had noticed was that the boards in this corner ran perpendicular to the boards in the rest of the cabin. "That's not normal," he said. "Usually, floorboards run the same direction throughout a structure. But here, it's like this corner was built separately, or rebuilt later." Margaret knelt down, ignoring her protesting knees, and examined the boards more closely. The wood was the same age, weathered and grey, but Harold was right. The grain ran the wrong direction. She ran her fingers along the seams between the boards, feeling for something, though she wasn't sure what. Then she found it. A gap, barely wider than a fingernail, but definitely deliberate. She traced it with her finger, following it in a rectangle about 3 feet by 3 feet. "Harold," she said quietly, "I think there's a door here." They spent the next 20 minutes clearing debris from the area. Snow that had drifted through the broken roof, chunks of collapsed timber, years of accumulated pine needles and leaves. The more they cleared, the more obvious the seam became. And then Margaret saw it. A metal ring, recessed into one of the floorboards, green with oxidation but solid. Her hands were shaking as she cleared the last of the debris away from it. "This was hidden on purpose," Harold said. "Those shelves we saw yesterday, they were built to conceal this." Margaret looked at the shelves again, seeing them with new eyes. They weren't just built into the wall. They were positioned to block the view of this corner from the door. Anyone entering the cabin would see the fireplace first, then the windows, then the shelves. But they wouldn't see this corner, wouldn't think to look behind the shelving unit. "Should we open it?" Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer. Harold nodded. "We didn't come all this way to stop now." Margaret gripped the metal ring with both hands. It was so cold it burned even through her work gloves. She pulled. Nothing. The door, if that's what it was, hadn't moved in decades. Harold positioned himself beside her, and together they pulled harder. "On 3, Harold said. 1, 2, 3. They heaved with all their strength. Margaret felt something in her back protest, but she didn't let go. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a crack echoed through the cabin, sharp as a gunshot. The door lifted half an inch. Again. Harold gasped. They pulled again, and this time the door rose another inch. Rust and dirt crumbled from around the edges. A third pull, and suddenly the resistance gave way. The door swung open with a groan of metal and wood that sounded almost alive, revealing darkness below. Cold air rushed out of the opening, carrying a smell that Margaret would later struggle to describe. Earth and stone. Yes, but also something preserved. Something that had been sealed away from the world for longer than seemed possible. It wasn't unpleasant, just strange and deeply old. Harold shone his flashlight down into the darkness. The beam revealed stone steps, narrow and steep, descending into what looked like a tunnel carved from solid rock. "That's not a root cellar," Margaret whispered. "No," Harold agreed, his voice tight. "That's something else entirely." They both stood at the edge, looking down. Margaret's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Every practical thought in her head screamed at her to close the door, walk away, call someone with authority and proper equipment. They were in their 70s, alone in the wilderness, about to descend into an underground chamber of unknown depth and stability. But another voice, quieter but more insistent, told her this was why they'd come. This was what Ernest Calloway had wanted them to find. Why else leave the property to distant relatives he'd never met? Why else carve coordinates into a fireplace, hide a door beneath carefully positioned shelves, preserve a cabin that should have rotted away decades ago? "I'm going down," Margaret said. "Not alone, you're not," Harold replied. They prepared as carefully as they could. Harold tested the first step with his cane, applying pressure before trusting it with his weight. It held solid. Margaret kept one hand on the stone wall as they descended, feeling the cold seep through her glove. Their flashlights created wild shadows that danced ahead of them like living things warning them back. 1 step. 2. 5. 10. The air grew colder with each step, but stayed dry, preserved, like the air in a tomb sealed for centuries. Margaret counted under her breath. 15 steps. 20. 25. At 33 steps, her foot touched level ground. She swept her flashlight around, and her breath caught in her throat. They were standing in a chamber carved entirely from rock. The walls were smooth, showing marks of careful excavation. The ceiling rose about 8 feet above their heads, supported by massive timber beams that looked ancient but solid. The space was roughly 15 feet square, and everything about it spoke of deliberate, patient construction. "This took years to dig," Harold said, his voice echoing slightly. "Someone spent years creating this space." "But why?" Margaret asked. Then her flashlight beam caught the far wall, and she had her answer. Shelves, built into the rock itself, carved from the same stone as the chamber, and on those shelves, stacked neatly in rows, were wooden crates. Dozens of them, maybe 40 or 50, each about the size of a shoebox. They looked old, but remarkably well preserved, protected from weather and moisture by the sealed chamber. Margaret and Harold moved forward slowly, their flashlights converging on the shelves. The crates were made of dark wood, reinforced at the corners with metal brackets. Each one was latched with a simple but sturdy metal clasp. "Do you think?" Margaret started, then couldn't finish the thought. Harold reached for the nearest crate. His hands were shaking as he worked the clasp. It resisted for a moment, then clicked open. He lifted the lid slowly, as if afraid of what might be inside. The beam of Margaret's flashlight fell on the contents, and time seemed to stop. Inside the crate, nestled on what looked like old velvet cloth, were 4 bars of metal. They were roughly the size of playing cards, but thicker, and even tarnished and dull in the poor light. There was no mistaking what they were. Gold bars, each one stamped with markings that Margaret's trembling flashlight could barely make out. Harold lifted one with shaking hands. It was heavy, impossibly heavy for its size. He angled it toward his flashlight, and the stamp became clear. 20 ounces. Fine gold. 1,946. Margaret couldn't breathe. Her chest felt tight, her vision narrowing to just that 1 bar of gold resting in Harold's weathered hands. This couldn't be real. They were 2 elderly people barely scraping by on fixed income, and they were standing in an underground chamber holding what had to be thousands of dollars worth of gold. Harold set the bar back carefully, as if it might break. Then, moving like he was underwater, he reached for another crate. This one was slightly larger. He opened it with fingers that wouldn't stop shaking. More gold. This time, coins. Hundreds of them, glinting in the flashlight beam. American gold eagles, their eagle designs still sharp despite age. Margaret's legs gave out. She sat down hard on the dirt floor, her flashlight dropping and rolling, casting crazy shadows around the chamber. Harold knelt beside her, his hand on her shoulder. "Margaret," he said. "Margaret, are you all right?" She couldn't answer. She just pointed at the shelves, at the rows and rows of crates. They hadn't even opened yet. Harold helped her to her feet, and together they began opening crates. Each one revealed more impossible wealth. Gold bars of different sizes, some as small as a matchbox, others as large as a brick. Gold coins from different countries and different eras. Krugerrands from South Africa, Canadian maple leafs, historical coins that looked like they belonged in museums. One crate held nothing but jewelry, heavy pieces with the unmistakable weight of real gold. They worked in silence, opening crate after crate, their shock deepening with each discovery. Margaret tried to keep count, but lost track after 30 crates. Each one held enough gold to pay off their mortgage 10 times over, 20 times over, enough to live comfortably for the rest of their lives. And they'd only opened half the crates. "Harold," Margaret finally managed to say, "how much do you think is here?" Harold shook his head. He looked pale in the flashlight beam, older than his 75 years. "I don't know. Millions. Tens of millions. Maybe." Margaret's mind couldn't process numbers that large. She'd spent her life counting pennies, worrying about whether they could afford the heating bill, whether Harold's medication would be covered by insurance. The concept of millions felt abstract, impossible, like trying to imagine the distance to the stars. Then Harold found something that changed everything. In one of the last crates they opened, beneath a layer of what looked like antique gold coins, was a small leather-bound notebook. The cover was worn but intact, protected by the sealed environment. Harold lifted it carefully and opened to the first page. The handwriting was neat, precise, the work of someone who'd learned penmanship in an era when such things mattered. At the top of the page, in careful script, it read, "Inventory, Ernest C. Calloway. Begun, June 1946. What followed was a meticulous list. Each entry described a piece of gold, its weight, its origin when known, and its approximate value. The entries continued page after page, dated over a span of nearly 50 years. The last entry was dated March 1997. Harold flipped to the final page, and Margaret saw his face go white. She leaned over to read what he was seeing. At the bottom of the last page, in the same careful handwriting but shakier now, as if written by older hands, were 3 lines. Total gold by weight, 8,200 pounds. Estimated value as of March 1997, $218 million. Current estimated value adjusted for market prices, $265 million. Below that, one final line. If you found this, you were meant to find it. Use it wisely. Protect it fiercely. Trust no one. Margaret's hands went numb. The flashlight slipped from her fingers, and this time, Harold didn't pick it up. They stood in the dimness, the weight of that number crushing down on them like the tons of earth and stone above their heads. $265 million. The number was so large it became meaningless, abstract. Margaret tried to picture it. She couldn't. She tried to imagine what that kind of money could do, what it could buy, how it could change their lives. Her mind simply refused to process it. "Harold," she whispered. "Harold, we need to leave. We need to get out of here right now." He nodded, moving like he was in a dream. They closed all the crates carefully, arranging them exactly as they'd found them. Margaret picked up both flashlights, with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. They took one last look around the chamber, their lights sweeping across the stone walls, the timber supports, the rows of crates holding more wealth than most people would see in 100 lifetimes. Then they started back up the stairs. Margaret counted each step, using the numbers to anchor herself to reality. 1, 2, 3. The climb felt longer than the descent. Each step an effort, each breath coming harder in the thin air and thick shock. At 33 steps, they emerged into the ruined cabin. The daylight streaming through the broken roof seemed impossibly bright after the darkness below. Margaret's eyes watered. Or maybe she was crying. She couldn't tell anymore. Harold closed the hatch carefully, making sure it settled exactly right. Then together they piled debris back over it. Snow, broken timber, pine needles, everything they'd cleared away. They worked methodically, almost frantically, covering every trace of what they'd found. When they finished, the corner looked exactly as it had when they'd first arrived. Just another section of collapsed floor. In a ruined cabin, no one would ever guess what lay beneath unless they knew exactly where to look. They stood in the center of the destroyed cabin, breathing hard, not from exertion but from the weight of what they now knew. Margaret looked at Harold and saw her own shock and fear reflected in his eyes. "What do we do?" she asked. Harold shook his head. "I don't know. But Margaret, we can't tell anyone. Not yet. Not until we understand what this is and where it came from." "Someone hid this gold," Margaret said, her voice shaking. "Someone went to incredible lengths to hide it, to preserve it, to keep it secret, and they left it to us. Why? Why us?" The question hung in the cold air between them. They had no answer. They started the hike back to the truck in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Margaret's mind raced through possibilities, each one more troubling than the last. Gold didn't just appear. Someone had mined it, or bought it, or stolen it. Someone had transported it to this remote location, dug that chamber by hand, carefully stored and catalogued every piece. That kind of effort suggested the gold was either extremely valuable, extremely illegal, or both. And the final message in the notebook, "Trust no one," suggested that whoever had hidden this wealth had been afraid. Not just cautious, but genuinely frightened of what might happen if the wrong people learned about it. When they reached the truck, Harold paused with his hand on the door. "Margaret," he said quietly, "when we get home, we act normal. We don't change anything. We don't tell anyone where we went or what we found. We need time to think, to figure out what this means." Margaret nodded. "But Harold, $265 million. Someone's going to be looking for that. Someone always looks for that kind of money." "I know," Harold said. "That's what scares me." They drove home in silence. The highways that had seemed so beautiful on the drive out now felt exposed, vulnerable. Every car that passed seemed threatening. Every town they drove through felt like it held watching eyes. By the time they pulled into Helena, Margaret was exhausted not from the hike or the discovery, but from fear. They pulled into their driveway just after 6 in the evening. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across their modest street. Everything looked normal. Their neighbor was walking his dog. A kid down the street was riding a bike. The world had continued on, completely unaware that 2 elderly people had just discovered enough gold to buy and sell the entire neighborhood 10 times over. Margaret gathered their backpacks, while Harold locked the truck. She was about to head inside when something made her pause. A feeling, nothing more than that, but strong enough to make her turn and look down the street. 3 houses down, a dark sedan was parked at the curb. It hadn't been there when they left that morning. The windows were tinted, making it impossible to see inside. The engine was off, but something about it suggested occupancy, a sense of patient waiting. "Harold," Margaret said quietly, "that car." He turned and looked. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then the sedan's engine started, and it pulled away from the curb slowly, deliberately. As it passed under a streetlight, Margaret caught a glimpse of the driver, a man, middle-aged, wearing a dark jacket. He didn't look at them, but Margaret had the distinct impression he knew exactly who they were. The sedan turned at the corner and disappeared. "Maybe it's nothing," Harold said. But his voice lacked conviction. They went inside and locked the door behind them. Margaret immediately went to the windows and closed all the curtains, something she never did. She could feel Harold watching her, understanding her need to hide, to make their little house into a fortress, even though they both knew curtains wouldn't keep out whatever was coming. That night, they sat at the kitchen table with cups of tea neither of them drank, going cold in front of them. The notebook from the cabin sat between them, the inventory of impossible wealth. Margaret had photographed every page with her phone, not trusting that they could safely keep the original. "We need to understand where this gold came from," Margaret said. "Who was Ernest Calloway really? And why did he leave this to us?" Harold nodded. "Tomorrow, we start researching, but carefully. We can't let anyone know what we're looking for." They went to bed but didn't sleep. Margaret lay in the darkness, listening to Harold's breathing beside her, and tried to process everything that had happened. Just 2 days ago, they'd been worried about whether they could afford new tires for the truck. Now they had access to wealth beyond imagining, and all she felt was terror. Because somewhere out there, someone knew about that cabin. Someone had been watching it. Maybe for years, maybe for decades. Someone who'd been patient enough to wait for the right moment, the right opportunity. And now that moment had arrived, because Margaret and Harold, 2 elderly people who'd never hurt anyone, who'd worked hard their whole lives and asked for nothing but a quiet retirement, had stumbled into something dangerous. The gold in that chamber wasn't just wealth. It was a secret that people had killed to protect, that people had died trying to find, and now that secret belonged to them. In the darkness, Margaret heard a sound outside, the soft crunch of footsteps on the frost-covered grass. She held her breath, listening. The footsteps moved along the side of the house, slow and deliberate, then stopped directly outside their bedroom window. She reached over and gripped Harold's hand. He squeezed back, and she knew he'd heard it too. They lay frozen, barely breathing, as the footsteps resumed and moved away. A minute later, they heard a car engine start somewhere down the street. Then silence. "Margaret," Harold whispered, "we're in over our heads." She knew he was right. They'd thought finding the cabin would answer questions, maybe give them a small windfall to help with retirement. Instead, they'd found something that people would kill for, something that was already bringing danger to their door. And the worst part was, they couldn't just walk away. The property was legally theirs. The gold was technically theirs by inheritance. But possession and ownership were 2 very different things, especially when it came to wealth this vast and this mysterious. "Tomorrow," Margaret said quietly into the darkness, Tomorrow we figure out what Ernest Calloway was hiding, and why he chose us to find it. But even as she said it, she wondered if tomorrow would be too late. If the people watching their house, following their movements, waiting in dark sedans on quiet streets, if those people would give them time to uncover the truth, or if the discovery they'd made that day had set in motion events that would destroy them before they ever understood what they'd found. Outside, the dark sedan had returned to its spot 3 houses down. Inside it, a man made a phone call. "They found it," he said simply. "They were in the chamber for over an hour. They know what's there." A pause as he listened to instructions. "Understood," he said finally. "We'll move to phase 2. He ended the call and settled back to watch the house where Margaret and Harold Foster lay awake in fear. Their lives changed forever by a discovery that was meant to save them, but might instead cost them everything. The next morning, Margaret woke to find Harold already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. The coffee pot was empty, suggesting he'd been up for hours. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked. He shook his head. "I kept thinking about those footsteps, about that car. Margaret, someone knows. They've been watching that cabin, and now they're watching us." Margaret poured herself coffee with hands that still trembled from the previous day. "We need to understand what we're dealing with. Who was Ernest Calloway? Where did that gold come from?" Harold turned his laptop toward her. "I've been searching all morning. Ernest Calloway shows up in public records exactly once. A death certificate filed 6 months ago in Billings. Cause of death listed as natural causes, age 98. But before that, nothing. No birth certificate, no census records, no tax returns. It's like he didn't exist until he died." Margaret sat down heavily. "How is that possible?" Harold pulled up another window. "I found something else. A newspaper article from 1998. It mentions an Ernest C. from the Upper Bitterroot region among a list of missing persons from the 1940s and 50s. He turned the screen so Margaret could read. The article was titled "The Mystery of the Missing Miners," and detailed how 14 men had disappeared from the Bitterroot area between 1945 and 1952. Most were independent prospectors and miners. None of the bodies had ever been found. "Look at this part," Harold said, pointing to a specific paragraph. "Local authorities suspected claim jumping, rival miners killing each other over valuable finds. However, despite extensive searches, no significant gold discoveries from this period were ever officially recorded in the Bitterroot region." Margaret's stomach churned. "You think our Ernest Calloway was one of those missing miners? Or," Harold said slowly, "he was the one who made them disappear." They spent the rest of the morning digging deeper. Margaret called the county clerk's office in Mineral County, where the cabin was located, asking about historical property records. The clerk, a helpful woman named Diane, promised to pull what she could find and call back. While they waited, Harold searched old newspaper archives. He found more articles about the missing miners, each one adding pieces to a disturbing puzzle. The disappearances had occurred over 7 years, all men working independent claims in remote areas, all vanishing without trace. Federal authorities had investigated in 1949 but found nothing conclusive. Then Harold found something that made his blood run cold. An article from October 1947 detailed a violent confrontation between federal agents and illegal miners. 2 miners had been killed in a shootout. The article mentioned that agents had recovered approximately $50,000 worth of gold, but sources suggested significantly more remained unaccounted for. "Margaret," Harold said quietly, "what if Ernest Calloway was part of an illegal mining operation? What if that gold in the chamber was hidden from federal authorities? Or stolen from other miners?" Margaret added, thinking of the 14 men who'd vanished. The phone rang, and they both jumped. Margaret answered, her heart pounding. It was Diane from the county clerk's office. "Mrs. Foster, I found something interesting about your property. The land was originally claimed in 1942 by a man named Ernest Calvin Calloway. But get this, in 1972, the same property was reclaimed by an Ernest Charles Calloway. The county assumed it was a clerical error, that the middle initial had been recorded wrong the first time. But looking at the signatures on both documents, they're completely different." Margaret's mouth went dry. "So, there were 2 different men using the same name?" "Appears so," Diane confirmed. "The first Ernest Calloway's claim went dormant in 1948. Then, 24 years later, a different man with almost the same name filed a claim on the exact same parcel." "Thank you," Margaret said. "That's very helpful." After she hung up, she looked at Harold. "Someone took a dead man's identity and claimed his land." Harold nodded grimly. "Which means the Ernest Calloway who died 6 months ago wasn't the original owner. He was an imposter who knew about the gold and spent decades protecting it." "But why?" Margaret asked. "Why hide it for over 50 years? Why not sell it and live comfortably?" Harold stood and walked to the window, carefully pulling back the curtain just enough to look outside. The dark sedan was back, parked in the same spot, 3 houses down. "Maybe," Harold said slowly, "because he was afraid. Because whoever that gold really belonged to, or whoever wanted it, they were dangerous enough that hiding for 50 years seemed safer than trying to profit from it." Margaret joined him at the window. The sedan's windows were tinted, but she could make out a silhouette inside. Someone was definitely watching their house. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "We need to talk about your inheritance. Name a place. Come alone." Margaret showed Harold the message, her hand shaking. "Don't respond," Harold said immediately. "They're trying to isolate you." But another message came through before Margaret could reply. "We know you visited the property yesterday. We know what you found. You're in danger from people who aren't as reasonable as we are. Let us help you." "Who are you?" Margaret typed back. The response came instantly. "Friends of Ernest. He would have wanted us to protect you. Coffee shop on Main. 2 p.m. today." Margaret looked at Harold. "Should I go?" "Absolutely not," Harold said. "Margaret, these people have been watching us. They followed us to the cabin. They know what's in that cellar. They're not friends, they're predators." "But they're right about one thing," Margaret said. "We are in danger. If there are multiple groups looking for that gold, if there are people who've been searching for decades, then maybe talking to one of them is the only way to understand what we're up against." Harold was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I'm coming with you. I don't care what the message says. We're not splitting up." At 1:45 that afternoon, Margaret and Harold walked into the Sunrise coffee shop on Main Street. It was a small, local place they'd been to dozens of times, familiar and public. Harold had insisted on arriving early, finding a table near the back where they could see the entrance. At exactly 2 p.m., a man walked in. He was in his 60s, tall and lean, with silver hair and a face weathered by time and sun. He wore a wool coat over a button-up shirt. Expensive but understated. His eyes scanned the room and landed on them. He walked over without hesitation. "Mrs. Foster." "Mr. Foster," he said, his voice smooth and educated. "Thank you for coming. I asked Mrs. Foster to come alone, but I understand your caution. May I sit?" "Who are you?" Harold asked bluntly. The man sat down without waiting for permission. "My name is Daniel Cross. I represent certain interests related to the property you inherited." "What interests?" Margaret asked. Daniel folded his hands on the table. "Mrs. Foster, what do you know about Ernest Calloway?" "Not much," Margaret admitted. "We just learned he existed when we inherited the property." "Let me fill in some blanks," Daniel said. "The man who died 6 months ago and left you that cabin was not the original Ernest Calloway. The original Ernest was my grandfather. He was a miner who worked in the Bitterroots in the 1940s. In 1947, he and several partners were running an independent operation. Not illegal, just unreported, to avoid excessive federal taxation during wartime restrictions." Harold leaned forward. "And what happened to your grandfather?" Daniel's jaw tightened. He and another miner were killed in a raid by federal agents. The agents claimed they found gold that had been hidden from government requisition, and that my grandfather and his partner resisted arrest. My family has always believed it was murder disguised as law enforcement. "I'm sorry," Margaret said carefully. "But what does this have to do with us?" Daniel's eyes hardened. The gold that was supposedly recovered by agents, $50,000 worth, was only a fraction of what my grandfather and his partners had accumulated. The rest disappeared. For 76 years, my family has been searching for it. We believe it's hidden somewhere on or near that property." "You believe it," Harold said, "but you don't know for certain." "We didn't," Daniel agreed, "until you visited the property yesterday and spent 3 hours there. Longer than it would take to simply look at a collapsed cabin. Long enough to find something significant." Margaret's heart pounded. She forced her voice to stay calm. "Even if there was something there, what makes you think it belongs to your family?" Daniel reached into his coat pocket, and Harold tensed. But he only pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a photograph, old and faded. It showed 4 men standing beside a mine entrance, tools in hand, smiling at the camera. "That's my grandfather," Daniel said, pointing to one of the men. "Ernest Calloway is next to him. The other 2 are Thomas Reed and James Dalton. The 4 of them were partners. When my grandfather was killed, the partnership should have dissolved, and the assets distributed to the surviving families. Instead," Margaret said slowly, "someone hid everything and disappeared." Daniel nodded. "The man who took Ernest Calloway's identity, we don't know who he really was. One of the partners who survived? Someone who killed them all and stole their gold? We've spent decades trying to find out. And now you want us to tell you if it's there," Harold said. Daniel leaned back. "I want to make you an offer, a generous one. $200,000, cash, for the deed to the property. No questions asked, no inspection needed. You sign over the land and walk away wealthy enough to live very comfortably." Margaret and Harold exchanged glances. 200,000 was more money than they'd ever dreamed of having. But it was also a fraction, an insulting fraction, of what was actually hidden in that cellar. "That's a substantial offer," Margaret said carefully, "but we need time to think about it." Daniel's expression hardened slightly. "Mrs. Foster, I'm not the only one looking for that property. There are others, less reasonable than I am, who've been searching for decades. People who believe that gold was stolen from them, who lost family members to whatever happened in those mountains. You're in danger whether you know it or not. Is that a threat?" Harold asked, his voice low. Daniel stood up. "It's a warning. You have 48 hours to consider my offer. After that, I can't guarantee your safety." He walked out, leaving Margaret and Harold sitting in stunned silence. Margaret's hands were shaking as she reached for her coffee. "Harold, what do we do?" Before Harold could answer, Margaret's phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. This time a photo. It showed their house, taken from across the street, with a timestamp from that morning. Below it, a message. 200,000 is pennies. The real offer is 500,000. Same terms. 48 hours. "How many people are out there?" Margaret whispered. Harold took her phone and stared at the message. "We need help. Professional help. Someone who can protect us and help us figure out the legal situation." Margaret nodded. Her nephew Marcus was a criminal defense attorney in Billings. If anyone could help them navigate this nightmare, it would be him. What happens next will turn this inheritance upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the greatest treasures come with the deadliest secrets. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. That evening, Marcus arrived at their house after a 2-hour drive from Billings. He was 38, sharp-eyed, and had the kind of intensity that came from years in criminal court. Margaret and Harold had sworn him to secrecy before he left Billings, and he'd agreed to come without telling anyone where he was going. They sat in the living room, curtains drawn, speaking in low voices even though they were alone. "Aunt Margaret," Marcus said after they'd told him everything, "you realize you're sitting on what might be stolen property? If that gold was hidden from federal authorities, if it was taken from other miners, then legally it might not be yours at all. But it was left to us," Margaret protested, "through legal inheritance." Marcus shook his head. "Inheritance only transfers legitimate assets. If the assets themselves were obtained illegally, then the inheritance doesn't make them legal. So what do we do?" Harold asked. Marcus pulled out a notepad. "First, we need to verify exactly what's there. Document everything. Second, we need to research the legal history. Find out if there are any claims against the estate, any families who might have legitimate ownership. Third, we need to understand who these people are, who are making offers and threats. And fourth," Margaret asked. "Fourth," Marcus said grimly, "we need to keep you both alive long enough to figure out the first 3. Over the next 3 days, Margaret and Harold became prisoners in their own home. Marcus hired a private security firm to watch the house. 2 retired police officers who worked in shifts. The dark sedan disappeared. But Margaret suspected the watchers had simply become less obvious. Marcus worked tirelessly, digging through historical records, filing legal inquiries, tracking down descendants of the missing miners. What he found was disturbing. Of the 14 miners who disappeared between 1945 and 1952, 9 had surviving family members who'd spent decades searching for answers. Several had filed legal claims in the past, arguing that their relatives had been murdered for their gold. All the claims had been dismissed for lack of evidence. But Marcus found something else, something that changed everything. In 1948, 1 year after the federal raid, a man named James Dalton had surfaced in Seattle using a different name. He'd been arrested for attempting to sell gold bars without proper documentation. In his confession, he'd claimed the gold belonged to him and his deceased partners, that they'd been running a legitimate mining operation that had been violently shut down by overzealous federal agents. Dalton had served 2 years in federal prison. When he was released in 1950, he'd disappeared completely. No death certificate, no further records. Marcus showed Margaret and Harold the arrest photo. James Dalton had been 28 in 1948, which would make him over 100 years old now if he were still alive. "But look at this," Marcus said, pulling up another photo. "This is Ernest Calloway's death certificate photo from 6 months ago." Margaret stared at the images side by side. The Ernest Calloway, who died at 98, bore a striking resemblance to a much older version of James Dalton. "Oh my God," Margaret whispered. "James Dalton took his partner's identity, which means," Harold said slowly, "that the gold in that cellar belonged to the mining partnership, Ernest, James, and the others. When Ernest was killed in the raid, James hid the rest of the gold and went into hiding." "But why hide for over 50 years?" Margaret asked. "Why not sell the gold gradually and live comfortably?" Marcus pulled up another document, because in 1949, federal authorities issued a warrant for James Dalton's arrest, not just for the gold, but for the murder of 2 other partners, Thomas Reed and another miner. They believed Dalton had killed them to avoid splitting the gold. "So, he was wanted for murder," Harold said. "That's why he hid. And that's why," Marcus added, "there are multiple groups looking for that gold. You've got descendants of the dead miners who believe it rightfully belongs to them. You've got descendants of Ernest Calloway who believe it was stolen from their family. And possibly you've got federal authorities who might still consider it evidence in an unsolved crime." Margaret felt sick. "Marcus, we can't keep this gold, even if it's legally ours, through inheritance. Morally, it belongs to the families of the dead miners." "Maybe," Marcus said, "but we need to be careful about how we handle this. If we just turn it over to authorities, it could be seized and tied up in legal battles for decades. The families might never see a penny." "So what do we do?" Harold asked. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "I think," he said finally, "we need to contact all the surviving families, bring them together, lay out what we found and what we know, and figure out a fair way to distribute it." "And the people making threats?" Margaret asked. "We deal with them by making this public," Marcus said. "Once everyone knows about the gold, once there are multiple legal claims filed, it becomes too complicated for any one group to simply take it by force." That night, Margaret couldn't sleep again. She lay in bed listening to Harold's breathing beside her and thinking about James Dalton, the man who'd lived under a false name for over 50 years. Had he been a murderer who killed his partners? Or a survivor who'd witnessed the brutal killing of his friends and hidden the evidence to protect it until the truth could come out? She got up quietly and went to the kitchen. Through the window, she could see one of the security guards sitting in his car, keeping watch. It should have made her feel safe. But instead, it just reminded her how much danger they were in. Her phone buzzed. Another unknown number. But this message was different. It wasn't an offer or a threat. It was an address in Butte, Montana, and a single line of text. "If you want the truth about James Dalton, come alone. Tomorrow, noon. This is your only chance." Margaret stared at the message. Every instinct told her not to go, that it was obviously a trap. But another part of her, The part that had insisted on visiting the cabin in the first place. The part that had pulled open that hatch. Despite the danger, that part needed to know the truth. In the morning, she told Harold she was going shopping with an old friend. She hated lying to him, but she knew he'd never let her go to Butte alone. She left while he was in the shower, driving her old sedan instead of his truck in case anyone was tracking them. The drive to Butte took 90 minutes. The address led her to a small house on the edge of town, modest but well-maintained. An old truck sat in the driveway. As Margaret pulled up, the front door opened, and a woman stepped out. She was elderly, perhaps 90, but stood straight and strong. Her eyes were sharp as she watched Margaret approach. "Mrs. Foster," the woman said. "I'm Catherine Reed. Thomas Reed was my father. I need to show you something." Margaret followed her inside. The house was neat, filled with photos and memories of a long life. Catherine led her to a back room that had been converted into a kind of archive. The walls were covered with newspaper clippings, maps, photographs, and documents. "I've spent 75 years researching what happened to my father," Catherine said. "He was one of the miners who disappeared in 1947. For most of my life, I believed he'd been murdered, either by federal agents or by his partners. But 5 years ago, I found something that changed everything." She pulled out a box from beneath a desk. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to Catherine, but never mailed. "My father wrote these," Catherine said, her voice trembling. "He wrote them over decades, from 1948 until he died in 1996. I found them in a safety deposit box under a false name. He left instructions that they should be given to me after his death, but the bank lost track of them. They only found them 5 years ago and traced them back to me." Margaret's hands shook as Catherine handed her one of the letters. It was dated March 1948, written in a shaky hand. "My dearest Catherine," it began. "By the time you read this, I hope you'll be old enough to understand why I had to disappear. The federal raid that killed Ernest and Daniel wasn't about illegal gold. It was murder, pure and simple. Agents wanted our find for themselves, and when we refused to reveal where we'd hidden the bulk of it, they killed Ernest and Daniel as a warning. James and I escaped, but we knew they'd hunt us down. We decided to split up, each taking a new identity, each hiding part of the gold until it was safe to come forward. James became Ernest Calloway. I became Martin Fletcher. We swore that if anything happened to either of us, the other would make sure the gold reached our families. I've lived 46 years in hiding, Catherine. 46 years unable to see you grow up, to hold you, to be your father. But I kept my promise. The gold is hidden where James and I agreed. If you're reading this, it means I've passed, and James has too. Find the cabin in the Bitterroots. Find the gold, and make sure it goes to all our families, not just ours, but Ernest's and Daniel's too. That's what we all wanted, to take care of the people we loved. I'm sorry I couldn't be there for you, but I hope you'll understand. I was protecting you the only way I knew how. Your father, Thomas Reed." Margaret's eyes were full of tears when she finished reading. Catherine handed her another letter, this one from 1996, clearly written by a dying man. "Catherine, if you found these letters, then you know the truth. James kept his promise. The gold is still hidden where we left it. The coordinates are carved in the fireplace, though James was clever enough to make them look like something else. I'm dying now, and I hope James has managed to outlive me by many years. He was always the stronger one, Make sure the families get what's owed to them. All the families. That gold cost too much already. Don't let it cost any more. Your loving father." Margaret looked up at Catherine through her tears. "Your father didn't disappear. He went into hiding to protect you and the gold." Catherine nodded, wiping her own eyes. "But James Dalton, the man who became Ernest Calloway, he kept his promise too. He hid the gold for over 50 years, waiting until it was safe, until everyone involved was dead, and the federal agents who'd murdered his partners couldn't come after him." Margaret realized the full truth then. The gold wasn't stolen. It wasn't illegal. It was payment for lives destroyed, families shattered, by a corrupt federal raid 76 years ago. "Catherine," Margaret said, "there are people threatening us, claiming the gold belongs to them." Catherine's face hardened. "Daniel Cross," she said, "Ernest Calloway's grandson. He's been searching for years, but not to distribute it fairly. He wants it all for himself. Claims his grandfather was murdered and robbed by his partners." "That's not true," Margaret said. "No," Catherine agreed. "But he's convinced himself it is. And he's not the only one. There are others, descendants of miners, who disappeared, who believe their relatives were killed by James and Thomas. They're wrong, but they're dangerous." "What do I do?" Margaret asked. Catherine reached out and took Margaret's hand. "You bring the truth to light. You prove what really happened. And you make sure that gold goes to everyone it was meant for." When Margaret returned home that evening, Harold was frantic. "Where were you?" he demanded. "I've been calling for hours." Margaret told him everything. About Catherine Reed, about the letters, about the truth of what had happened 76 years ago. Harold listened in stunned silence. Then he said, "We need to contact Marcus. We need to bring all the families together and tell them the truth." But that night, as they prepared for bed, Margaret heard something that made her blood run cold. The sound of breaking glass from the living room. Harold grabbed his cane, and they moved carefully to the bedroom door. Through the crack, they could see a shadow moving in the darkened living room. "Call 911, Harold whispered. But before Margaret could reach for her phone, the bedroom door burst open. 2 men in dark clothes and ski masks stood in the doorway. "Give us the coordinates," one of them said, his voice muffled. "Tell us where the gold is, and we'll leave. Refuse, and this gets ugly." Margaret's heart hammered so hard she thought it would break through her ribs. Harold stepped in front of her, raising his cane like a weapon. "Get out of our house," Harold said, his voice shaking but firm. The intruder pulled out a gun, and Margaret screamed. Outside, one of the security guards heard the scream and radioed for help. But inside, Margaret and Harold faced down 2 armed men who'd waited 76 years for this moment and weren't about to leave empty-handed. The truth about the gold was finally coming to light. But the question remained whether Margaret and Harold would survive long enough to see justice done. The gun gleamed dully in the dim light of the bedroom, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. Margaret could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, feel Harold's body tense in front of her as he held that cane like it could somehow protect them from a bullet. Then a voice shouted from outside, "Police! Drop your weapon!" The security guard had called for backup the moment he heard the breaking glass. Within seconds, the house was flooded with light and sound. The 2 intruders bolted, pushing past Harold and running for the back door. Margaret heard shouts, running footsteps, Then the unmistakable sound of someone being tackled to the ground. Police officers flooded into the house, weapons drawn. One officer, a woman in her 40s, approached Margaret and Harold gently. "Are you hurt? Did they touch you?" Margaret shook her head, unable to speak. Harold's hands were trembling so badly his cane clattered to the floor. The female officer, whose nameplate read Martinez, led them to the living room and sat them down. Within minutes, both intruders had been apprehended and dragged back into the house in handcuffs. Martinez pulled off their ski masks, revealing two men in their 50s, both with hard faces and desperate eyes. "Do you know these men?" Martinez asked. Margaret and Harold shook their heads. One of the men spat on the floor. "You have no idea what you're sitting on, old woman. That gold belonged to my grandfather. It was stolen from him, and you have no right to it." Martinez's eyes narrowed. "Gold?" She looked at Margaret and Harold. "I think we need to have a longer conversation." What followed were 3 hours of questioning at the police station. Margaret and Harold, with Marcus present as their attorney, told the entire story. The inherited cabin, the hidden cellar, the gold, the threatening messages, the competing claims. They held nothing back. Martinez listened carefully, taking notes. When they finished, she sat back and exhaled slowly. "This is way beyond local jurisdiction," she said. "We're talking about potential federal crimes, historical evidence, multiple state claims. I need to involve the FBI." Harold gripped Margaret's hand. The two intruders were brothers named Carson and Michael Briggs, descendants of one of the missing miners. They'd been tracking the cabin for 20 years, waiting for someone to claim the inheritance and lead them to the gold. "They're not the only ones," Margaret said quietly. "There are others. Daniel Cross, Catherine Reed, probably more we don't even know about." Martinez made a call. By morning, FBI agents had arrived in Helena. The lead agent was a man in his early 50s named Robert Chen. He sat across from Margaret and Harold in an interview room, his expression neutral, but his eyes sharp with intelligence. "Mr. and Mrs. Foster," Agent Chen said, "what you've stumbled into is one of the longest-running cold cases in Montana history. The disappearance of 14 miners. The federal raid in 1947. The murder allegations against James Dalton. We've had files on this for decades. Then you know about the gold," Harold said. Chen nodded. "We've suspected for years that a significant amount of gold was hidden somewhere in the Bitterroots. But the original Ernest Calloway's claim was so remote, and the area so vast, that we never found it. And honestly, after 50 years, most people assumed the gold had been found and sold long ago, or that it never existed in the first place. But it does exist," Margaret said. "And we can show you exactly where it is." Chen leaned forward. "Before we get to that, I need you to understand something. If that gold was obtained illegally, if it's evidence in unsolved crimes, then the federal government has the right to seize it. You might not see a penny." Margaret had expected this. "But we didn't do anything wrong. We inherited property legally. We didn't know what was there." Chen's expression softened slightly. "I believe you, and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure this is handled fairly. But there are no guarantees. What if we could prove the gold was obtained legally?" Marcus interjected. "What if we could show that the miners were the victims, not the criminals?" Chen raised an eyebrow. "How would you do that?" Margaret told him about Catherine Reed, about the letters from Thomas Reed that proved the federal raid had been corrupt, that agents had murdered miners to steal their gold. Chen was quiet for a long moment. "If those letters are authentic," he said slowly, "then this isn't just about the gold anymore. It's about federal agents committing murder and covering it up for 76 years. Catherine gave me permission to share everything," Margaret said. "She wants the truth to come out. She doesn't even care about the money. She just wants her father's name cleared." Chen made a decision. "All right, here's what we're going to do. Tomorrow, we go to the cabin. We document everything. We bring in forensic accountants, historians, and legal experts. We build a complete picture of what happened, and then we figure out the right thing to do with that gold." The expedition to the cabin took place 3 days later. It was like a small military operation. FBI agents, forensic teams, historians from the Montana Historical Society, representatives from the Bureau of Land Management, Marcus, and Margaret and Harold themselves, all making the hike through the snow to that forgotten cabin on the mountainside. Margaret felt strange, returning to the place that had changed their lives. The cabin looked the same, collapsed and snow-covered, but now it was surrounded by people, equipment, and purpose. Agent Chen supervised as his team carefully excavated the hidden hatch. When they descended into the chamber, the reaction was everything Margaret and Harold had felt, multiplied by a dozen. Hardened FBI agents stood speechless. Forensic accountants pulled out equipment with shaking hands. The historians began documenting everything with an almost religious reverence. The inventory took 2 full days. Every bar was weighed, every coin counted, every piece of jewelry documented and photographed. The final tally was staggering: 8,372 pounds of gold. Current market value, adjusting for the specific purity and historical significance of some pieces, $268 million. But more important than the gold itself was what else they found. Hidden in a sealed metal box at the back of the chamber was a journal. It had been kept by James Dalton, writing as Ernest Calloway, documenting everything that had happened in 1947. The journal told the true story. 4 partners, Ernest Calloway, James Dalton, Thomas Reed, and Daniel Cross, had been working a legitimate gold claim. They'd been careful, paid their taxes on some of it, hidden the rest to avoid excessive wartime federal seizures. In October 1947, federal agents had raided their operation, not to enforce the law, but to steal the gold for themselves. James's handwriting grew shaky as he described the violence. Ernest and Daniel had been shot when they refused to reveal where the bulk of the gold was hidden. Thomas and James had escaped, but barely. They'd watched from the trees as their partners' bodies were dragged away, as the agents loaded the small cash they'd found and left, as their whole world burned down around them. "Thomas and I made a pact," James had written. "We would hide the gold, split up, take new identities, and wait until it was safe. We agreed that if anything happened to either of us, the survivor would make sure the gold reached all 4 families: Ernest's, Daniel's, Thomas's, and mine. That was the promise we made, standing over the graves we dug for our partners in the cold Montana ground." The journal continued for decades. James documented his life in hiding, his constant fear that the corrupt agents would find him, his determination to keep his promise. When Thomas died in 1996, James had been devastated, but had continued alone, waiting for the right moment that never seemed to come. The final entry was dated 2 months before James died. "I'm 98 years old," he wrote. "I've outlived everyone, the good and the bad. The agents who killed my partners are dead. Thomas is gone. I have no family of my own. I've left this property to the closest living relatives I could find, distant cousins of Ernest's, who I hope will be honest people. If they find this gold, I pray they'll do what Thomas and I couldn't. Bring the truth to light. Make sure all the families know what really happened. And divide this wealth fairly among Ernest's, Daniel's, Thomas's, and my descendants. We earned it honestly, we hid it bravely, and it should finally go to the people we loved. When Agent Chen finished reading the journal aloud to the assembled group, there was absolute silence. Margaret found tears streaming down her face. This wasn't a story about greed or theft. It was a story about loyalty, about 4 men who'd built something together, and 2 survivors who'd sacrificed their entire lives to honor their fallen friends. Chen looked at Margaret and Harold. He left this to you because he believed you'd do the right thing. The question is, what is the right thing? Over the next 3 months, the process of determining the legal ownership and distribution of the gold became a national story. News outlets covered it extensively. Descendants of all 4 original miners were located. Catherine Reed represented her father, Thomas. Daniel Cross's daughter, a woman named Patricia, came forward, her anger dissolving into grief when she learned the truth about her grandfather's death. Ernest Calloway's real family, distant cousins who'd had no idea he'd existed, were found in Oregon. And James Dalton's only living relative, a great-niece he'd never met, traveled from California. The FBI concluded that the gold had been legally mined and that the 1947 raid had indeed been a corrupt operation conducted by agents who'd been subsequently fired but never prosecuted. The statute of limitations had long since expired, but the historical record was corrected. The names of Ernest Calloway, Daniel Cross, Thomas Reed, and James Dalton were officially cleared. The legal resolution took 6 months. Marcus worked with federal prosecutors and a team of estate attorneys to create a distribution plan that honored James's wishes. The gold would be divided 5 ways, 20% to each of the 4 families of the original miners, and 20% to Margaret and Harold Foster, in recognition of their role in bringing the truth to light and their legal inheritance rights. Margaret had protested. "We don't deserve 1/5 of it," she'd argued. "We didn't do anything but open a hatch." But Agent Chen had been firm. "You did more than that. You refused bribes, you resisted threats, you chose truth over easy money, and you brought justice to 4 men who'd been waiting 76 years for someone to tell their story. You earned this." When the final distribution was calculated, each family received approximately $53 million. Margaret and Harold's share came to $53,600,000. The number was incomprehensible. Margaret had spent her entire life counting pennies, and now they had more money than existed in her entire hometown. The first thing they did was cry. The second thing they did was call their children and grandchildren. The third thing they did was make a plan. They started with Catherine Reed. She was 90 years old and had spent 75 years searching for the truth about her father. Margaret and Harold invited her to Helena and presented her with something more valuable than gold. A letter they'd found in James's effects that Thomas Reed had written to his daughter, but never sent. "My dearest Catherine," it read, "every day I don't spend with you is a day I've failed as a father. But I want you to know that everything I've done, every sacrifice I've made, has been to keep you safe. You are my greatest achievement, my proudest accomplishment. I love you more than words can express. Your father." Catherine held that letter, and wept like she was 15 again. Mourning a father she'd barely known, Margaret held her hand and cried with her. Two women, separated by age, but united by the strange gift of this story. With their share of the gold, Margaret and Harold established the Four Miners Foundation, dedicated to supporting families affected by mining disasters and industrial accidents. They partnered with legal aid organizations to help workers fight corporate exploitation. They funded scholarships for children of miners, ensuring that the next generation would have opportunities their ancestors had been denied. They set up a museum in Helena, telling the true story of Ernest, Daniel, Thomas, and James. The journal was displayed behind glass, James's shaky handwriting a testament to courage and loyalty. School children came on field trips, learning about integrity and sacrifice. Historians came to study one of the most remarkable stories of the American West. The Carson and Michael Briggs, the men who'd broken into their home, were prosecuted, but given relatively light sentences when the full story came out. They'd been raised on stories of their grandfather being murdered for his gold, and they'd spent their lives seeking justice the only way they knew how. Margaret and Harold didn't press for harsh punishment. They understood desperation, understood how the promise of wealth could twist people. Daniel Cross, who'd offered them $200,000 for property worth millions, apologized publicly. He'd been wrong about his grandfather's partners, wrong about the gold being stolen. He used his share to establish a foundation similar to Margaret and Harold's, working to reform federal law enforcement practices and provide oversight to prevent future abuses. As for Margaret and Harold themselves, their lives changed in ways both profound and simple. They paid off their mortgage, bought new hearing aids without worrying about the cost, replaced the truck that had been on its last legs. But mostly, they stayed in their modest house, in their quiet neighborhood, living simply. The difference was internal. They no longer counted pennies with anxiety. They no longer feared the future. They could help their grandchildren with college, donate to causes they believed in, and sleep peacefully, knowing they'd done the right thing, even when it would have been easier, safer, and more profitable to do wrong. 1 year after finding the gold, Margaret and Harold returned to the cabin one final time. The FBI had restored it as part of the historical site, reinforcing the structure, replacing the roof, preserving it as a monument to the four miners who'd lived and died for their principles. They stood inside the restored cabin, looking at the stone fireplace where Ernest Calloway had carved his initials 76 years ago. The coordinates were still visible, a secret message that had waited decades to be decoded. We did right by them, didn't we? Margaret asked. Harold put his arm around her shoulders. We did exactly what James asked. We brought the truth to light. A tour group entered the cabin, led by a young historian who enthusiastically told the story of the four miners, their corrupt federal adversaries, and the elderly couple who'd chosen integrity over easy wealth. Margaret and Harold slipped out quietly, not wanting recognition or attention, as they walked back to their truck, now new and reliable. Margaret thought about the journey they'd taken. It had started with a letter about an inheritance they'd never expected, led them to a secret that had nearly destroyed them, and ended with a resolution that had brought justice to four men and their families after nearly 8 decades. We could have sold the deed to Daniel Cross for $200,000, Margaret said. Could have walked away wealthy and never known any of this. Harold took her hand. Would you change it if you could? Margaret thought about Catherine Reed finally learning the truth about her father. About Patricia Cross discovering her grandfather had been a victim, not a villain. About the scholarships being awarded, the families being helped, the story being told. "No," she said firmly. "Not for anything." That evening, they hosted a dinner at their home. All the descendants of the 4 miners came, along with Marcus, Agent Chen, and Catherine Reed. They ate simply but well, sharing stories and laughter, connected by a tragedy from before most of them were born. Catherine raised her glass. To Ernest, Daniel, Thomas, and James, 4 honest men who refused to compromise their principles, even when it cost them everything. Everyone raised their glasses. And to Margaret and Harold, Agent Chen added. 2 honest people who honored their memory. Margaret felt Harold squeeze her hand under the table. She looked around at the faces gathered in their small dining room. People who'd been strangers a year ago, now connected like family by gold and grief. And justice finally served. This, she realized, was the real treasure. Not the metal in that underground chamber, but the connections forged, the truths revealed, the wrongs made right. The gold had been the catalyst, but the legacy was something deeper, the proof that integrity still mattered, that courage could still change the world, that ordinary people could still make extraordinary choices. 3 years later, Margaret was invited to speak at a conference on ethics in inheritance law. She stood at a podium in front of 200 lawyers, judges, and legal scholars, her silver hair catching the lights, her voice steady with conviction. "When my husband and I inherited that cabin," she said, "we were just trying to get by. We weren't looking for adventure or wealth. We certainly weren't looking to solve a 76-year-old mystery. But sometimes life gives you a choice. Not the choice you want, but the choice you need." She paused, looking out at the audience. "We could have taken the easy money, could have sold the property and never looked back, and no one would have blamed us. We were elderly, struggling financially, with every reason to put ourselves first. But we kept thinking about those 4 men, about the lives they'd lived, the promises they'd kept, the decades James Dalton spent in hiding to honor his friends. How could we do less?" The room was silent, every person leaning forward. "The money changed our lives," Margaret continued, "but not in the ways you might think. We don't live in a mansion. We don't drive fancy cars. The real change is that we sleep peacefully now, knowing we made the right choice. We wake up every morning grateful for the chance we were given to bring justice to 4 men who deserved it." She smiled. "If there's one thing I want you to take from our story, it's this. Integrity isn't about grand gestures or perfect circumstances. It's about doing right when doing wrong would be easier. It's about honoring promises even when no one's watching. It's about believing that truth matters, even 76 years later." The applause was thunderous. Several people were crying. After her speech, a young woman approached, maybe 30 years old, with determined eyes. "Mrs. Foster," she said, "I'm a public defender. Most days I want to quit, because the system feels so broken, so weighted against the people I represent. But your story reminded me why I started." "Thank you." Margaret hugged her. This stranger who suddenly felt like family. "That's all any of us can do," she said. "Keep showing up. Keep fighting for what's right. Keep believing it matters." On their 50th wedding anniversary, Harold surprised Margaret with a gift. It was a framed photograph of the restored cabin, taken in summer when wildflowers bloomed around it. Below the photo, a plaque read, "Where courage meets consequence, legacy is born. Ernest, Daniel, Thomas, James, never forgotten. Margaret hung it in their living room, where she could see it every day. A reminder of the unlikely adventure they'd stumbled into, the dangerous path they'd walked, and the right choice they'd made when wrong would have been so much easier. Harold's health began to decline in their 77th and 78th years. His hip finally required replacement surgery. His heart, worn from decades of hard labor, needed medication to keep rhythm. But his spirit remained strong, buoyed by the knowledge that their lives had mattered, that they'd been part of something important. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sun set over Helena, Harold turned to Margaret with tears in his eyes. "We could have died that night," he said. "When those men broke in, we could have lost everything." Margaret took his hand. "But we didn't. We survived, and we made sure 4 good men's story finally got told." Harold nodded. "No regrets?" "Not one," Margaret said firmly. "Would you do it again?" Harold was quiet for a moment, then smiled. Every single time. The Four Miners Foundation grew beyond anything they'd imagined. By its 5th year, it had distributed over $10 million in scholarships, legal aid, and disaster relief. It had helped change federal regulations on mining safety, pushed for greater transparency in law enforcement, and supported hundreds of families facing the kinds of challenges the 4 miners had faced 76 years ago. Margaret and Harold had created something that would outlive them, a legacy built not on wealth, but on the principles that wealth had allowed them to champion. When Margaret was invited to appear in a documentary about the case, she agreed on one condition: that equal time be given to telling the stories of Ernest, Daniel, Thomas, and James. Not as victims or heroes, just as men who'd worked hard, done their best, and remained loyal to each other even in death. The documentary premiered at a film festival in Montana. All the descendants attended, sitting together in the theater, watching their grandfathers' and great-grandfathers' stories unfold on screen. When it ended, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. Catherine Reed, now 95 and frail but still sharp as ever, stood slowly at the end. She looked at Margaret and Harold in the front row. "My father wrote that he hoped the gold would reach people who would use it to heal," she said, her voice carrying through the theater. "He would be so proud of you both." The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. As Margaret and Harold drove home that night, Harold asked the question that had been on both their minds. "What do you think James felt?" he asked, "in those final days, knowing he'd kept his promise but never seeing it fulfilled?" Margaret thought about the journal entries, about James's shaky handwriting documenting 50 years of waiting, of sacrifice, of faith that someone would eventually find what he'd hidden and do the right thing. "I think," she said slowly, "he felt peace. He'd done everything he could. The rest was faith." Harold nodded. "Like us, we found it. We made the right choices, and the rest is up to the next generation to carry forward." Margaret squeezed his hand. "We did good, Harold. That cabin could have been our undoing. Instead, it became our purpose." On their 80th birthdays, celebrated together since they were born just 3 months apart, the town of Helena threw them a celebration. Over 500 people attended. Descendants of the 4 miners, FBI agents who'd worked the case, lawyers and judges, families helped by the foundation, and neighbors who'd known them for decades. The mayor presented them with keys to the city. A senator read a proclamation honoring their integrity. But the moment that meant the most came when a young girl, maybe 10 years old, approached with a handwritten letter. "Mrs. Foster, Mr. Foster," she read carefully. "My name is Emma. My daddy died in a mining accident 2 years ago. Your foundation paid for me to go to camp, and for my mom to get training for a new job, and for us to keep our house. I just wanted to say thank you for helping us when we didn't know where to turn. You're my heroes." Margaret knelt down, her old knees protesting, and hugged Emma tight. "You're going to do great things," she whispered. "Your daddy would be so proud." That night, lying in bed, Margaret and Harold talked about legacy, about what they'd leave behind when they were gone. "The money will help people long after we're gone," Harold said. "The foundation will continue. The story will be remembered." But Margaret knew it was more than that. It was the choice they'd made, the integrity they'd shown, the example they'd set. That was the real legacy. Not the gold, not the foundation, not even the justice they'd brought to 4 long-dead miners. It was the proof that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when faced with the right choice at the right moment. "Anyone can find wealth," Margaret said quietly into the darkness. "But not everyone has the courage to use it wisely." Harold's hand found hers in the dark. "We did, though." "Yes," Margaret smiled. "We did. Years would pass. The 4 Miners Foundation would continue its work, helping thousands of families, changing lives, creating opportunities. The museum would educate generations of children about integrity and sacrifice. The story would be told and retold, each version emphasizing different elements, but all agreeing on the core truth. 2 elderly people, struggling to make ends meet, inherited a forgotten cabin and discovered a fortune. They could have kept it all. They could have taken the easy money and disappeared. They could have made 1,000 different choices that would have been simpler, safer, more profitable. But they chose integrity. They chose truth. They chose to honor the memory of 4 men they'd never met, and keep a promise made by a dying man who'd spent 50 years in hiding to protect something precious. And in doing so, they proved that the greatest treasures aren't found in underground chambers or hidden cellars. They're found in the choices we make, the principles we uphold, and the legacy we leave behind. Margaret and Harold Foster didn't just find gold. They found purpose. They found meaning. They found proof that even in a world that often rewards greed and punishes honesty, integrity still matters. Courage still counts. And ordinary people can still change the world if they're brave enough to do the right thing. The cabin in the Bitterroots still stands, restored and preserved, a monument to 4 miners who refused to compromise and 2 elderly people who honored their memory. Visitors come from around the world to see where the story unfolded, to stand in the chamber where $268 million lay hidden for decades, to touch the stones that witnessed both tragedy and triumph. But the real story isn't in that cabin. It's in the lives changed by the foundation, in the families helped, in the students educated, in the principles upheld. It's in the choice Margaret and Harold made to look beyond their own needs and see a bigger picture, a grander purpose, a legacy worth building. Sometimes the greatest inheritances come wrapped in danger and doubt. Sometimes the biggest treasures come with the hardest choices. But for those brave enough to choose integrity over ease, truth over comfort, justice over profit, the rewards are greater than any amount of gold. Because at the end of the day, we don't just inherit property or wealth. We inherit stories, legacies, and the choice to honor them or abandon them. Margaret and Harold chose honor, and in doing so, they became part of a story that would inspire generations. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful true stories waiting for you. Click to keep discovering with us. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe the greatest treasures are the ones we share with others.